I want to thank y'all for coming. My name is Eric Jacobson, and I'm just going to talk for a few minutes, and I'm going to turn it over to Thomas. Wow, what an event. 146 years ago, as we speak, one of the most, I guess, incredible, violent, terrible struggles of the Civil War was unfolding along about 1.5 mile front. U.S. Army has arrived here early on November 30th, stops in Franklin only because they cannot get across the Harpeth River. Their intent was to evacuate at 6 p.m. They formed up a defensive line on the south edge of town. The very center of the U.S. line, we're actually standing inside the U.S. defensive perimeter. The Carter family would certainly find their lives forever changed by the events of that day. The Confederate Army, in rapid pursuit from the south, coming up from Spring Hill, began to form up along the base of a range of hills 1.75 miles south of here. Confederate General John Bell Hood, in a desperate effort to prolong the war, trying to drag things out, trying to recapture Nashville, believes that Franklin is his last chance to destroy the Federal Army, commanded by an old West Point classmate, John Schofield. Hood issued orders for a massive frontal assault. Several of his subordinate officers voiced their obvious concerns about an attack across what was then wide open and rolling farmland. I've said for a long time that commanding generals have to make terrible decisions. Hood's decision at Franklin is one that would haunt he and the men who survived this battle to their own graves years later. 20,000 Confederate soldiers stepped off that afternoon right at 4 o'clock. Arguably the single largest infantry assault of the entire war. They moved forward toward a U.S. line that was defended by an equal number of soldiers. We can talk a lot about strategies, units, and even names, but the men on these two sides were very similar in many respects. They were separated sometimes by distance and ideology, but these were farm boys, young and middle-aged men mostly, from across about 20 to 25 different states: Tennessee, Ohio, Mississippi, Alabama, Michigan, Wisconsin. A lot of men who'd seen a lot of terrible combat. Those who survived Franklin would say that it was the most terrible battle that they were ever involved in. At about 4:30, the sheer force of the Confederate attack ruptures the very center of the U.S. line, located about 250 yards south of where we are. And there's a moment, or two, or three, or four, where this desperate gamble by General Hood is working. He has buckled, and his men, led by some of the bravest officers I think the world has ever known, ripped a huge hole in the center of this stout U.S. defensive position. Moscow Carter would later say this hole was nearly 200 yards wide. It extended from nearly where the modern-day visitor center is to at least 75 yards east of Columbia Pike. And Confederate soldiers from General Claiborne's and General Brown's division began pouring into the interior. And the battle hangs in the balance. But the sun is setting, it's soon dark. Two factors have a huge impact on what happened here that afternoon. An incredibly valiant stand by newly recruited soldiers from Missouri and Ohio. Buy enough time for a single Federal brigade commanded by Emerson Updike to push forward, and in unison these recruits and these veterans helped plug the hole. And as Thomas will tell you eloquently for the next few minutes, what unfolds is pure savagery. A Southerner who survived it later said the devil had full possession of the earth. And it sounds so Victorian, but if you saw the scenes play out that he did, it was very, very true. In closing, I'll say that we talk a lot about the battle. We talk about it every day. Those of us who work for the Battle of Franklin Trust. I have the, I would say, distinct honor of working with people who believe that this is one of the most incredible stories, not just of the Civil War, but in American history. And there were two families who were impacted by the events of that night. They were civilians like most of us. The Carters and the McGavicks found their very lives completely violated by the events of that night. John and Carrie McGavick and their children would spend that night caring for hundreds of Southern wounded who were taken to their house. The Carters would seek refuge in the basement of their once quiet home. And out on the field to the southwest, probably about right now, Todd Carter, who hadn't been home for 3.5 years, would come charging across that very ground, trying to get back home. As I'm sure most of you are aware, Todd did not, well, he got home, but he didn't make it home in the way that either he or his family could have ever envisioned. He was terribly wounded. The battle would rage on heavily until about 7. It was all over by 9. The casualties were unbelievable. Numbers, though, only tell part of the story. What happened in Franklin was the last great drama of the American Civil War. This was the last great battle between these two old foes, who were so similar in some respects, but had fought so desperately across so many battlefields. The Southern Army essentially died at Franklin. It was a shell of itself. One side has to emerge victorious in war. And after this, the end came very quickly. So I'll turn it over to Thomas.